The community was in shock, but this time, something was different. There was a change in the air, a shift in the dynamic of the investigation. The police were closing in, and James could feel it. General Hayes, Senator Lee, and former President Trump sat in the eye of a storm that no one saw coming. What began as a routine military briefing quickly spiraled into a deadly game of deception, betrayal, and shocking confessions. As the camera rolled live, Hayes's words sent shockwaves through the nation, revealing a covert alliance between top U.S. officials and Russia, a collaboration that would not only shake the foundations of American politics, but threaten the very security of the free world. It was supposed to be a typical Senate hearing, a standard briefing on military intelligence meant to inform Congress about the status of Russia's growing military strength. The American public had been hearing about Russia's military buildup for months, but few expected anything more than a few dry updates. The hearing, broadcast live to the nation, began without fanfare. Senators shuffled through their notes, and military commanders took their places, ready to discuss the routine matters of defense, budgets, and international security. But the moment General David Hayes, a senior commander of U.S. military intelligence, began speaking, something felt different. His usual confidence was replaced by a subtle unease, his hands slightly trembling as he adjusted his microphone. The questions from the Senate panel started off predictable enough. What were Russia's latest military advancements? How would the U.S. respond to their growing arsenal? The generals replied with their standard assessments. Russia was indeed strengthening its military, modernizing weaponry, and expanding its reach, but nothing in their answers hinted at anything out of the ordinary. It wasn't until Senator Catherine Lee, a former intelligence officer, pressed deeper, asking about the real impact of Russia's military growth on U.S. security, that the tension in the room began to escalate. General Hayes, she asked firmly, how serious is the threat we face from Russia right now? Should Americans be worried? For a moment, Hayes hesitated. His eyes darted toward his colleagues, then back to the senator. He cleared his throat and answered in a voice that barely masked his discomfort. Russia's military capabilities are increasing, yes, but... His pause hung heavy in the air. There's more to this situation than what we're discussing publicly. Things that go beyond just their military hardware. The senators leaned in, sensing that this wasn't just another prepared response. Hayes's words were deliberate, carefully chosen, but they left an unsettling feeling in the air. The audience, both in the room and at home, began to sense something. More was at play. What did he mean by more? Hayes's sudden unease seemed to indicate there was something far bigger lurking beneath the surface, and soon the questions would take a turn that no one anticipated. As General Hayes's words hung in the air, the room grew tense. Senator Lee's gaze sharpened, her interest piqued by the commander's cryptic statement. She pressed harder, her voice steady but determined. What do you mean, General? Are you suggesting there's something we don't know? Something more than just Russia's military capabilities? For a moment, the general seemed to consider his options, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. He took a deep breath, then leaned forward, speaking with a slow deliberation that made everyone in the room focus more intently on his every word. I can't go into specifics right now, but yes, there are elements within our own government, people at the highest levels who've been, let's say, facilitating Russia's rise. The room fell silent. It was as if time had stopped for a split second. Everyone froze. Senator Lee's eyes narrowed, her voice barely above a whisper as she asked, "Facilitating? Are you implying that American officials have aided Russia's military strength?" General Hayes nodded, his face betraying a mix of discomfort and reluctant honesty. In certain areas, yes. I can't go further into it, but there's a network that has been quietly working with Russian interests, providing them with what they need. It's not what most people think. It's bigger than just military hardware or trade. There are alliances that have been formed in the shadows. The atmosphere in the hearing room shifted. Some senators exchanged wary glances, unsure of how to process what they had just heard. It wasn't just that Hayes was admitting to something illicit, it was the implication that the U.S. government itself might have been complicit in something far larger than anyone realized. And then, as if realizing how dangerous his words had become, Hayes quickly added, "I don't have all the answers, but what I know could change everything." The live broadcast cut to a wide shot of the room. The weight of Hayes' statement had visibly shaken the Senate committee, and viewers at home were left grappling with the magnitude of what had just been revealed. The hearing, intended to discuss a simple military concern, had suddenly become the stage for an unsettling revelation. People across the nation were left wondering, how deep did this go? And which leaders were involved in this covert collaboration? The tension in the Senate chamber was palpable, a thick cloud of uncertainty hanging over the proceedings. General Hayes sat rigidly, his face flushed with a mix of anxiety and resolve. The senators were stunned into silence, unable to comprehend the full weight of his admission. For a brief moment, the room was frozen, as if everyone was waiting for something, or someone, to break the silence. It was Senator Alan Foster who finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly as he addressed Hayes. "General, are you telling us that U.S. government officials, at the highest levels, have been actively involved in strengthening Russia's military power?" His words were a mix of disbelief and frustration. The general's gaze shifted briefly, then locked onto the senator. He nodded, his expression grim. "Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying," he replied, each word heavy with implication. "There's been a network, business, military, political. It's not just a handful of rogue actors. There's been a coordinated effort to ensure that Russia's military would be in a better position for global influence, at the expense of our own interests." A murmur spread through the room as the weight of Hayes' confession sank in. The live cameras, which had been focused on the senators, now panned across the faces of those in the audience. The shock was evident, not just in the senators' expressions, but in the whispers that began to ripple throughout the chamber. Some of the highest-ranking officials in the U.S. government were now being implicated in something much more sinister than anyone had anticipated. The air was thick with suspicion, and the stakes had just escalated to unprecedented levels. A young senator, freshly elected but known for his tenacity, leaned forward, his brow furrowed in a mixture of anger and confusion. "You're telling me that there's a conspiracy, a coordinated plan with U.S. officials working to undermine our national security and strengthen an enemy?" His voice was sharp, and the chamber fell into silence again. "Yes," Hayes responded quietly, his voice barely audible, as though speaking the truth out loud had become more difficult with each passing second. "It's not something we can easily undo. There are people who've been working across multiple administrations. The deals go far beyond politics. This wasn't just about Russia anymore. It was about a betrayal at the highest levels of the U.S. government." The public, watching this live, was now witnessing something they could never unsee. The questions were mounting, and the answers had only begun to complicate the mystery even further. How deep did this conspiracy run? And who could be trusted? As soon as the Senate hearing concluded, chaos erupted both inside the chamber and across the nation. News outlets scrambled to cover the shocking revelation, and social media exploded with speculation. The hashtag #SoccerRussiaGate quickly began trending, with millions of Americans reacting in real time to the commander's stunning confession. The airwaves were flooded with analysis, debates, and interviews, all trying to make sense of the explosive statement made by General Hayes. The public's reaction was immediate and polarized. For some, it confirmed their worst fears: an intricate web of corruption within the highest levels of government, possibly involving figures they had trusted. For others, it seemed like the beginning of a conspiracy theory that was too big to be real. With every new piece of information, the line between truth and fiction began to blur. Could it be that figures from the Trump administration were involved in a covert scheme to help Russia? Or was this simply an exaggeration, a moment of panic that would soon be proven false? The media was relentless. News networks went into overdrive, pulling in experts from all fields: politics, intelligence, history, to try to explain what had happened. Pundits were quick to dissect Hayes' words, analyzing every nuance, wondering what he meant by network, and whether the revelation could have deeper consequences than anyone realized. Some even speculated that Hayes had been forced into confessing, that there was more to his admission than just his own free will. Others pointed out that the general had been serving in a high-ranking position for years, and if he was now willing to speak out, it might indicate just how dire the situation truly was. Politicians from both sides of the aisle began issuing statements. Some demanded an immediate investigation, insisting that every last detail be uncovered. Others, however, were more cautious, urging for further inquiry before jumping to conclusions. But behind the scenes, panic was mounting. Lawmakers who had previously enjoyed a close working relationship with the Trump administration suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. The sudden shift in public opinion was creating cracks within the political establishment, as leaders scrambled to distance themselves from the growing scandal. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, there were whispers of what might come next. Who else was involved in this alleged conspiracy? What did Hayes know that he hadn't yet shared? The hearing had only just scratched the surface, and the investigation that would follow promised to be even more explosive. The nation, gripped by a sense of collective disbelief, could do nothing but wait for the next shoe to drop. In the days following the Senate hearing, the investigation into General Hayes's shocking revelation moved into high gear. The Capitol was abuzz with whispered conversations, as senators and representatives navigated the growing tension surrounding the claims of covert collaboration between U.S. officials and Russian interests. A full-fledged investigation was launched, led by a bipartisan Senate committee, and the hearings quickly gained national attention. What had begun as a routine briefing had now become the most significant political scandal in decades. The initial response from the intelligence community was a mix of denial and disbelief. Key military and political leaders denied any involvement in the conspiracy, but the more they spoke, the more questions emerged. Investigators began scouring financial records, looking for evidence of suspicious transactions or ties between American companies and Russian defense contractors. Leaked documents revealed troubling connections. Companies tied to former Trump administration officials had been involved in joint ventures with Russian firms known for their defense operations. It was clear that the U.S. had been doing business with Russia in ways that, at the very least, raised questions about loyalty and transparency. Behind closed doors, more whistleblowers came forward. Former aides, consultants, and advisors who had worked in the Trump administration began sharing their own stories, each one adding layers to the growing narrative. One former diplomat claimed to have attended a secret meeting in 2017 where high-ranking American officials had discussed how to ease sanctions on Russia in exchange for promises of future cooperation in defense and energy sectors. Another former national security advisor revealed that during high-level talks, there had been consistent attempts to downplay Russia's military threats in favor of forming an alliance. The implications were clear. There had been a concerted effort to position Russia as a powerful geopolitical ally, despite the risks it posed to U.S. security. The public was in shock as the story gained more traction. News outlets reported that certain military supplies, which had previously been earmarked for U.S. defense, were redirected to Russian forces under the guise of joint cooperation programs. It wasn't just the financial deals that were unsettling. What was the sheer scope of the operation? How had such a vast network of individuals, some from within the highest levels of government, managed to keep this secret for so long? As the investigation deepened, so did the intrigue. The political world seemed to fracture as former allies turned against each other. Accusations flew, and each new revelation added fuel to the fire, making it increasingly clear that the truth, if it ever came to light, would shake the foundations of American democracy. The investigation was only beginning, but already it felt like the country was on the brink of something much larger, a reckoning that could reshape the future of global politics. As the investigation continued to unfold, the scope of the conspiracy seemed to grow more complicated by the day. The Senate committee dug deeper into the connections between American and Russian business interests, and with every new lead, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in ways that were as disturbing as they were unexpected. More whistleblowers came forward, some providing damning documents, others offering crucial testimony that hinted at a much broader network than anyone had originally believed. One of the most shocking revelations came from a former U.S. ambassador to Russia, who claimed that certain American officials had been acting as intermediaries between Russian leaders and U.S. defense contractors, facilitating the sale of sensitive technology and military equipment. According to the ambassador, there had been numerous back-channel meetings between high-ranking officials in the Trump administration and Russian oligarchs, many of which were not documented and in some cases deliberately kept off the record. This revelation was particularly damaging because it indicated a deliberate effort to bypass traditional diplomatic and intelligence channels, further deepening the suspicion that a covert deal had been struck with Russia for mutual benefit. Meanwhile, the military itself was beginning to feel the heat. Commanders who had once been considered untouchable found themselves under intense scrutiny. Investigators discovered that key defense contracts which had been awarded to companies' ties to Russian interests were approved with little oversight. Some of these contracts involved the development of advanced missile systems and cybersecurity technologies, raising serious questions about how much influence Russia. Among the most crucial pieces of evidence were classified documents that had been leaked by insiders within the intelligence community. These documents confirmed long-standing suspicions. Not only had U.S. officials been covertly working to ease sanctions on Russia, but there was also evidence that the Trump administration had been actively involved in a plan to boost Russia's military capabilities. This plan had been put into motion through backdoor dealings with powerful Russian oligarchs and military contractors, who had been promised access to advanced American technology and resources in exchange for their cooperation. The shockwaves of these revelations were felt beyond the Senate hearings. World leaders were watching, and the implications for U.S. foreign policy were profound. Allies of the U.S. in Europe, particularly those in NATO, were rattled by the idea that their strongest partner had been quietly undermining their collective security for years. The rift between America and its traditional allies deepened, as they struggled to comprehend how the U.S. could have been complicit in actions that had strengthened Russia's position in global politics. Public trust in the U.S. government was at an all-time low. Citizens who had once believed in the system now questioned the very foundations of their democracy. The idea that powerful figures within the government could betray their own country in such a way was too much for many to process. Protesters took to the streets, calling for justice, while politicians who had once been supportive of Trump began to turn against him, sensing the shift in public sentiment. In the midst of this chaos, a crucial discovery emerged: an audio recording that had been hidden away for years. The recording, dated from a high-level meeting between Trump's senior advisors and Russian officials, confirmed that the U.S. had agreed to a series of covert military collaborations with Russia. The contents of the recording were explosive, and it was clear that the conspiracy went even deeper than anyone had imagined. The investigation had entered a new phase. The truth was now undeniable, and it was clear that those responsible would have to answer for their actions. The nation held its breath, knowing that the coming days would bring the final pieces of the puzzle together. And as the clock ticked down, the fear lingered that the repercussions of these revelations would be far-reaching, not just for the U.S., but for the entire world. The moment of reckoning had arrived. As the investigation pressed forward, the once insurmountable wall of secrecy surrounding the Trump administration's ties to Russia began to crumble. The leaked audio recording had sent shockwaves through both the political and intelligence communities. It was undeniable now. The U.S. had not only been working with Russia to bolster their military strength, but had done so with full knowledge of the potential consequences. As more details emerged, it became clear that the collaboration between certain officials within the Trump administration and Russian leaders was far more systematic and deliberate than anyone could have imagined. The Senate hearings turned into a media frenzy, with each new revelation drawing more viewers. For the first time in history, a scandal of this magnitude was unfolding in real time, leaving the American public on edge. The recordings revealed not just vague hints of collaboration, but explicit discussions of military strategies, covert arms deals, and strategies to weaken NATO's position in Europe. The conversations made it clear that a small elite group of individuals, some with deep ties to both the military-industrial complex and foreign business interests, had been actively working to shift global power dynamics in Russia's favor. Behind closed doors, the political fallout was even more intense. Former allies of Trump, once vocal defenders of his presidency, now scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Some feared for their own political futures, while others were concerned about potential criminal charges. The pressure was mounting, and as the days passed, the investigation revealed an even darker truth. Key players within the U.S. military, intelligence agencies, and foreign policy circles had been complicit, turning a blind eye to the broader geopolitical ramifications of their actions. The American people were increasingly divided. There were still pockets of unwavering support for Trump, fueled by claims of a deep state conspiracy against him, but for many, the evidence was irrefutable. In the court of public opinion, the former president's defense was quickly crumbling. His personal wealth, his business empire, and his influence all seemed intricately tied to the very network that had allegedly worked to undermine the national security of the USA's. The days grew longer. It was becoming evident that the truth, once a fragile whisper, was now a deafening roar. The country was on the brink of a monumental decision. Would the leaders involved in this covert alliance be held accountable, or would the system continue to protect them, allowing the country to remain divided and fractured? As investigators prepared for the final hearings, everyone braced for what would come next, knowing that the future of American democracy was hanging in the balance. The final chapter of the investigation began with an air of inevitability, as the Senate hearings reached their most crucial and tense moment. The evidence had mounted to an undeniable crescendo. What had once been whispered rumors and speculative reports was now solid fact. Key figures within the U.S. government, including high-ranking officials in the Trump administration, had been complicit in an orchestrated effort to strengthen Russia's military power, jeopardizing U.S. security and global stability. With the public demanding answers, the final hearings were the last chance to hold the guilty accountable. In the days leading up to the final testimony, a wave of resignations swept through Washington. Several top officials who had once been pillars of the political establishment were now stepping down, either out of fear or to avoid further scrutiny. Some, fearing the repercussions of the truth, had fled the country, seeking refuge in foreign nations. The once untouchable figures who had been part of the operation were now becoming pariahs, their names dragged through the mud in the media. The damage to the country's political credibility was already irreversible. The American public, still reeling from the revelations, watched with bated breath as the final pieces of the puzzle were revealed. In the Senate chamber, General Hayes took the stand once more. This time, however, his demeanor was far different than before. His face was pale, and his voice, while still resolute, had lost some of its earlier confidence. His testimony was as comprehensive as it was damning. He laid out the final details of the covert operation, confirming the extent of the collaboration between American officials and Russian leaders. The general spoke of secret meetings, undisclosed financial transactions, and back-channel communications that spanned multiple years. Every detail he provided painted a picture of a network of corruption that had reached the highest levels of government. But the true bombshell came when Hayes, his voice cracking with emotion, revealed that the operation had not been a one-sided effort. The U.S. officials involved had been promised more than just political favors. They had been promised protection from prosecution, from the truth. It had been a far-reaching conspiracy, involving not just Russian oligarchs but powerful figures within the American legal and military establishments, ensuring that any effort to uncover the truth would be thwarted. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Those watching at home, glued to their screens, could hardly believe what they were hearing. The confession had exposed not just a conspiracy of foreign influence, but a betrayal so profound that it threatened to unravel the very fabric of American democracy. As the hearings came to a close, the nation was left with more questions than answers. Who exactly would be held accountable? Could the system that had been compromised so deeply ever truly heal? The truth was out, but the path to justice was unclear. In the end, the world watched, knowing that the repercussions of these revelations would echo through history for years to come.